Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's exclusive Secure State webinar entitled Dissecting PCI DSS 3.0. My name is Michael Willett. I'll be your host today. I'm here with Nicholas Vaccarello. He's one of Secure State's senior consultants in our audit and compliance practice. Nick holds the CISA certification and is a PCI QSA. Hello, Nick.
Hi, Mike.
Thanks again very much for joining our webinar today. We ask that any of the questions that you may have during the webinar be reserved for the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. At that time, we'll do our best to answer as many questions as time will allow. As always, today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available afterward as an archive that you can review or forward on to your colleagues who may not have been able to attend. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand the webinar today over to our presenter. Take it away, Nick.
Good afternoon. So today we'll be talking about PCI DSS version 3. First, we'll give you a brief overview of Secure State for those of you not familiar with us. We'll talk about PCI in and of itself. I don't want to make the assumption that all of you are familiar with PCI. We'll talk a little bit about the changes, some thoughts and some strategies for compliance. Wrap it up with a summary of the changes, and then leave you some time for any questions that you may have specific to what we've discussed as well as anything else. So, with that said, let's talk just very briefly about Secure State. We are a management consulting firm specializing in information security. We've been in business for more than 12 years, and we have some specific credentials as it relates to PCI. We are an approved scanning vendor. We are a QSA company. That means that we've been approved by the council and to do QSA work. We have on staff PA or payment application QSAs. And then finally, we are PFI certified. And we're really excited about this last credential simply because we are one of 11 organizations across the country, across the United States, to have this certification. So that means that the payment card brands would contact us or would utilize a PFI in the event of a data breach or some type of compromise. And speaking of PFI, if you do have the time, I would like to refer you to, there is a webinar that was put together by our founder, Ken Stasiak, founder and CEO, as well as John Melvin, one of our PCI forensic investigators. It's a really good webinar on PCI compliance and the PFI process. If you have the time, it's actually pretty entertaining and very informative.
So we'd like to take a second here just to get a little bit of feedback from the audience here. So we're going to conduct a brief poll just to gauge a little bit of everybody's experience with PCI. Like Nick said, we can't automatically assume everybody is a PCI expert already. So if you don't mind, and just to prove that you're awake, just go ahead and answer our quick poll here. We'll share the results with everybody once they're done. Again, how much experience do you have with PCI? You could say you're new. You're just now learning. Second, you could say that you do have some experience, but you're still learning. Who isn't? And then if you're an old pro when it comes to PCI, you can potentially dream about PCI in your sleep. So we appreciate you giving us a little bit of feedback. That's very helpful to us to get a feeling of what our audience is doing out there. And like I said, we do appreciate you joining us today on this chilly day in Cleveland, Ohio, here at Secure State headquarters. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to end the poll and share the results with everybody. And Nick, I think it gives you a good feeling for who you're talking to. You're talking to some people that have experience with PCI, but they're still learning, particularly now that PCI 3 is come out. They published it in what, October?
Actually, 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
Early part of November, it became official.
So really digging down deep into the changes and the additions and the recommendations from PCI is a new topic now, and everybody's gearing up for the implementation of it by the end of the year. So that's who you're talking to. There's a few newbies, few rookies to PCI, and then there's some old pros here that we'd encourage to chime in. We have a chat bubble on the right-hand side of the screen. If you have comments or questions, you can fill us in with those. But like I said, we'll try to address those as time will allow at the end. So we're going to get back to the slide deck here. And go ahead, take it away.
So prior to the formation of the PCI Security Standards Council, each payment card brand ran their own security program. Due to an increase in the number of merchant data breaches, the brands decided to form the PCI Council in 2006, and hence the PCI DSS was formed. The Council, in and of itself, is responsible for the development, management, and education and awareness of making sure that folks understand what the data security standards are and what the expectations are. The standards cover everything from point of entry of card data into a system to how the data is processed and all the way through secure payment applications. And as I mentioned before, the Council is responsible for approving companies and their employees to perform PCI DSS assessments, payment application assessments, and ASV scanning. And again, just referring back to the PFI process, only individual payment brands can levy penalties and fines for noncompliance with PCI. The payment brands also initiate the process for compromise or data breaches as it relates to PFI investigations. So, who needs to be PCI compliant? Any entity involved in payment card processing, accepting, transmitting, or storing credit card data. Compliance with the DSS is an expectation by the payment card brands. The DSS is considered not a regulation like HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, any other privacy regulations that are mandated by the government, but PCI is considered a standard of care with the express purpose of protecting cardholder data. The volume of credit card transactions that are processed by an organization or a merchant or even a service provider really determine the specific compliance requirements that must be met or completed by merchants for PCI compliance. A merchant bank, or sometimes called the acquirer, is responsible for tracking merchants' PCI compliance and then ultimately reporting that compliance back to the payment card brands. So what we have here is the pictorial of the lifecycle changes for PCI DSS and the PADSS, the Payment Application Data Security Standard. As we know, the lifecycle takes 36 months and follows 8 stages. And the Council will continuously evaluate changes in technology and threats and issue mid-cycle supplements, such as what they did for mobile payment applications, wireless. Last November, I believe, they also issued a supplemental guide or a SIG guide on risk assessments. So they're constantly looking at the emerging threats, looking at new technologies, looking at ways to really address ways to improve the DSS. And it's important to note also that version 3 becomes effective January 1st of 2014, and businesses really have 1 year to apply it to their environment. Some of the changes that are future dated are considered best practices until July 2015, but we'll talk about that shortly. So what we have here is what I refer to as the PCI bloom. We have 12 requirements around 6 goal areas. But PCI DSS contains more than 220 preventative and detective controls designed to help organizations protect customer credit card data. The core 12 security areas of PCI DSS version 2 remain the same in version 3, but the updates include several new sub-requirements that didn't previously exist. So in version 3, there are features that really cut across all 12 requirements. That's the first time, obviously, since version 2 was published in 2010. So what we have here is a listing of the types of changes that have been proposed for version 3. We have the evolving requirements, clarifications, and the additional guidance. The evolving requirements are really the new requirements. These, in many instances, didn't exist previously. And in some instances, it's more of what the council is calling an enhancement. So in version 2, the requirement may have been split into 2, and then in version 3, they made just a clarification, added maybe just a bit more language, and what they did was consolidate it down to one requirement. But we'll get into some of those as well, some examples of that. But again, the evolving requirements are typically the new requirements that didn't exist. There are actually 13 of those that did not previously exist in version 2 that are now present in 3. The clarification is simply a clarification of the intent of the requirement, usually from version 2 to version 3. And then additional guidance, there's really only one of those. It's not really specific to the requirement, but just kind of offers a bit more explanation. Yeah. This table gives us an overall in terms of where the requirements for the evolving requirements, again, the new changes by PCI by sub-requirement. So as we're looking at this table, we see that for requirement 1, 1.1.2 and 1.1.3 are brand new requirements. I'm not going to go through all of these, but at the bottom you'll see that there's a total of 20 changes, 20 updates as it relates to the evolving requirements. And as you'll notice in the table, requirement 3 and requirement 4, as well as requirement 7, had no changes as it relates to the evolving requirements. This table just gives you a summation as it relates to the clarification. The number of clarifications by requirement. This gives us, at the bottom you'll see there's a total of 64 clarifications by requirement. So all of the requirements were touched with respect to clarifications or just for the council to allow some type of clarification or clarity on what the intent of the requirement is. And as I had said previously, only one requirement had some additional guidance. So let's dive right in. For requirement 1, we have 1.1.2, which is a current network diagram that identifies all connections between the cardholder data environment and other networks, including any wireless. Clarification on this is what should be included in the network diagram: network devices, networks that connect with the CD, and other components. This is really, in my opinion, a wording update, but basically in DSS version 3, the requirement is asking that the network diagram identify all connections between the CDE and other networks, including any wireless. The version 2 requirement for this, in this area, by the same requirement number, asks for current network diagram with all connections to the CDE. So we're talking very minor wording changes here. But again, the council thought that this was a big enough change that they wanted to really consider this as an evolving, as a new update. Next, 1.1.3 is really a new requirement. In previous, in version 2, there was no requirement that organizations or entities were required to show a data flow. Most clients that we talk to, and really your QSA should have been asking you for this document as part of a document request list. Or if they didn't ask for this by name, they should have conducted some type of verbal walkthrough with you to understand how you as an organization take or process credit card data and really how that flows through your merchant systems for authorization and ultimately for settlement. 2.4, this is a new one, new requirement to keep inventory of systems. It's part of good security practices to keep an inventory of your systems and system components, both on a hardware and a software level, but in particular for what's in scope for you folks, for PCI. What's really, and the intent behind this is that so that you have and can develop a configuration standard so that if you push a new server out, if you push redundant application out. You're able to configure those from previous documentation. Requirement 5. As we know from the folks that are familiar with PCI, Requirement 5 deals mostly with virus, antivirus. This is a new requirement, and the requirement really speaks to making sure that you're monitoring emerging trends in malware. So the common thought on this is that systems like mainframes, Linux, Unix-based operating systems are not really commonly affected by malware, and so they're mostly carved out of scope. So what the council has noticed this time and again, so it's really doing is pushing the vigilance back on the merchant to, as we know, mainframes are not necessarily a threat vector in terms of malware, but what they're asking you to do is monitor postings, monitor message boards and things like that for emerging threats, emerging vulnerabilities for your particular environment. Basically ensuring that these systems continue not to need antivirus software. 5.3, again, this is a new requirement that did not previously exist. Ensure that your AV solutions are actively running and cannot be disabled or altered by end users without some type of specific authorization by management. So really what they want to ensure is that end users are not able to disable antivirus on their workstations, causing that machine to be infected and ultimately be able to propagate to the rest of your network and be able to open up a door into your network. Moving on to requirement 6 at the bottom of this page. 6.5.10, as we know, section 6 deals specifically with software development. 6.5.10, the requirement speaks to broken authentication and session management. This is one of those that is considered a best practice until June 30th of 2015, after which the council is saying that it becomes a requirement. So essentially this is ensuring that software coding techniques and practices, as it relates specifically, in my opinion, to web applications and e-commerce infrastructures, that your coders are addressing broken authentication and session management by incorporating some type of timeout mechanisms and making sure that your session IDs are being rotated after successful login attempts, or successful logins. Requirement 8. My apologies. This slide looks a little busy, but 8.2.3 is really one of those requirements that I said that it's a combination of a couple. While this is considered a new requirement, it didn't previously exist in version 2.0. It's really a combination of requirement 8.5.10 and 8.5.11. The combined requirement is kind of met into a single requirement. It allows for a lot of flexibility for alternatives that meet the equivalent complexity and strength for making sure that your passwords, your passphrases have at least a minimum of 7 characters, and there's complexity. Complexity in this case is making sure that you're using both alphabetic characters and numeric characters in your passwords. And most organizations, this is a minimum these days. 8.5.1, again, this is a new requirement. This one speaks to service providers, folks that are providing some type of service to merchant organizations. And this is something that didn't exist before. It was born out of a particular data breach incident where a service provider was using one password for all of its customers that it provided services to on a remote basis. The password met the requirement of PCI version 2.0, in that it had complexity, alphanumeric, and it had the proper character length. But a hacker was able to gain access to one account, and then as a result of being able to gain access to one account, the hacker was also able to gain access to the rest of that service provider's customer accounts. So really what this requirement speaks to is making sure that your service providers have unique login credentials for each customer that they provide service to. Requirement 8.6. This is also a new requirement, and in environments where other authentication mechanisms are used, such as hard and soft tokens, certificates, that those authentication mechanisms are linked to a specific individual, and that only that particular user is able to gain access to using that authentication tool or mechanism. So really what you're trying to do is making sure that it's a one-for-one relationship. Requirement 9. As we know, this speaks to more physical security, and in version 3, this hasn't changed. The process is, for 9.3, pardon me, this is, again, a new requirement. And this is actually trying to ensure that physical access is only limited to those folks who have been granted authorization. Process to control physical access to sensitive information, and I interpret this as access to the server rooms or data center, which really houses the cardholder data environment or critical infrastructure like firewalls, routers, wireless access points. But I also take a broader look on this, and it could also include physical access to areas known to store paper copies of credit cards. So, this is also, we take somewhat of a wide interpretation on this, but again, this is new, and the idea is to make sure that you're controlling physical access to sensitive areas that are controlling or limiting that are controlling cardholder data environments. And 9.9, again, this is a new requirement, and this really speaks to, and this was one of the ones that you'll hear a lot of press about, inspecting POS machines used to swipe credit card data into a merchant system for payment processing. It speaks to ensuring that as a merchant, you're maintaining a list of your POS devices so that you would know if one went missing, and you're training your employees to know how to inspect a POS machine for tampering and really what to look for, so that if there was wires out of place, if there was some type of attachment at the bottom of a card swipe terminal, you would notice, or an employee should notice, that there has been card skimming machine has been attached. Also, part of this requirement is also ensuring that employees who are on the front lines, your clerks and your cashiers, know how to report this, the identification of some type of POS terminal tampering. In version 10, version 10 is logging, one of my favorite sections. This one speaks to, it's not a new requirement, but again, under the council's purview of this, it's an enhanced requirement, trying to ensure that elevation of privileges, if a hacker gains access to your network or to a critical application, ensuring that if they are able to elevate themselves to an account with privileges, like admin account, that type of activity is logged, and that any changes, deletions, for them to be able to cover their tracks would also be logged. And then 10.2.6 is just another supplement onto this, ensuring that logs capture all activity as it relates to, again, using that example that a hacker gains access to your network, if they tried to cover their tracks and tried to stop the logging or pause logging, that type of activity would be captured as part of your audit trails or your audit log. Section 11, maintain an inventory of authorized wireless access points, including a documented business justification. This, again, is an enhanced requirement. It's really updated language. And it's specific to maintaining an inventory so that when you go around and you walk around in your environment, or if you use some type of automated scanning tool, if your tool notes some type of rogue wireless, the technician is easily able to reconcile which of the wireless access points is authorized by management and which shouldn't be there, and which really should be followed up on and promptly removed from the environment. 11.1.2 is, again, just an enhanced requirement because this was is currently in version 2 or 2.0, making sure that any type of detection of a unauthorized wireless access point in your environment is included in your incident response. So just making sure that it's already aligned with your existing procedures so that you have some mechanism for responding to an incident, again, if your systems detect some type of wireless or rogue access point. (11.3), this was one of the more controversial new requirements for version 3. This deals specifically with pen testing or penetration testing. The new requirement, like I said, was discussed quite a bit at the recent community meeting in September to try to provide some type of framework for the completion of pen testing. And the hope is that merchants are sourcing their pen tests to reputable and experienced firms. Currently, there's no certification as it relates to PCI, like what I had noted initially at the outset of our presentation. There's an approved scanning vendor. There are QSAs. These are all endorsements made by the council. So there's no similar certification for internal and external pen testers. So most merchants outsource pen testing because it's a highly specialized expertise or skill set. And my experience is that some firms that perform pen testing follow frameworks such as NIST, SP800, or OWASP, but overall, many firms don't follow any type of real methodology on this. So organizations will have to be diligent as it relates to ensuring that the firm that they select as their pen testing firm uses some form of methodology, perhaps requiring that adherence to the methodology is part of the work proposal or statement of work. Again, that was a bit of controversy because, again, there's been a lot of ambiguity in terms of what pen testers, how they do what they do. Because, again, it's a highly specialized skill set. (11.3.4). This is a new requirement, and again, this is also related to pen testing, but the discussion around this is that if you're using segmentation to isolate your cardholder data environment from the rest of your network, the expectation is that you'll perform some type of, or outsource it, some type of pen test to understand if your segmentation mechanisms or controls are, number one, operational, and number two, that they're working as expected. And the expectation is that the validation is performed via some type of pen test, but I would really think it's reasonable to expect that this is part of your annual pen test, as mentioned previously in 11.3. But again, this is a new requirement under version 3. 11.5.1. Again, this is a new requirement, and this is considered, this appears to be more of an update, in my opinion, or an enhancement as the requirement for 11.5 in DSS version 2, because it speaks to ensuring that FIM, or file integrity monitoring tools, are configured to alert personnel of unauthorized changes to critical system files. But the updated language is specific in version 3 to ensuring that a process exists for personnel to respond to the alerts. So that's where the nuance is. That's where the council is really kind of hedging their bets as it relates to saying that this is an evolving requirement. This is really new. The FIM tools can, and the problem with this is that FIM tools can generate many alerts each day, with some alerts being significant and others not. So, and I expect to receive questions about how organizations are expected to respond to these types of alerts and how the response should be documented. Because again, the council wasn't very specific on really the process that should be followed, just that you should have a process. But again, much like logging, FIM alerts can come fast and furious, and so you need to be able to differentiate between which ones you need to act on and which ones you can filter out that it's just the FIM tool doing its work and move on. But it's the process and how you document that that we'll be interested in as part of the review process or an assessment process for a report on compliance. So Section 12, as we know, Section 12 deals mostly with policy. 12.2 is make sure that you implement a risk assessment process that's performed at least annually and upon significant changes to the environment. Identifies critical assets, threats, and vulnerabilities, and results in some type of formal risk assessment. So the council is calling this a new requirement. In my opinion, this is just updating the language because in version 2, there was a requirement to make sure that merchants or entities and organizations perform an annual risk assessment process. The nuance, or really the new language, is making sure that after any significant change in the environment. That's where it is. So many organizations already perform risk assessments of their cardholder data environment. This is one of those that I expect to get questions and challenges on from clients about what constitutes a significant change. So this is, again, a point of ambiguity that we'll have to try to work through, but that's that the council is trying to say after a significant change. So significant changes can be an update to your cardholder data environment. You just rolled out a new application. You acquired an organization, you went through a divestiture, any of those sorts of things that obviously you'd want to have discussions about with your QSA, what that means and maybe how that's changed the scope of your PCI environment. 12.8.5, this talks about, this is one of the other requirements that was spoken highly of as it relates to service providers, really managing the relationship between service providers and merchants. This I refer to as the contract language requirement. It really spells out, or the intent is to spell out or explicitly identify which aspects of the PCI DSS are covered by the merchant, as well as the expectation for management of outsourced operations by the service provider. So if Mike is a service provider and I'm a merchant, we want to make sure that the contract language covers the expectations on both sides so that at the end of the day, if the payment brands say that we've detected a data compromise, it's not a hot potato incident where Mike steps back 2 steps and I step back 2 steps, and it's something that stepped on the floor that neither one of us will take responsibility for. So this is one of those things that want to make sure that the language speaks to where the ownership lies. Uh, 12.9. So this is also a new requirement, but this is a responsibility as it relates to service providers. And only service providers have to really respond to this particular requirement. This is one of those that also is a best practice until June of 2015, June 30th of 2015, after which time it becomes a requirement. So this is really, service providers have to provide some type of acknowledgement to their customers that they're responsible for the security of all cardholder data in their possession, or to the extent that their operations impact the security of their customers' cardholder data environment. So basically, again, just kind of showing the ownership perspective between service providers and merchant organizations. So a bit of the hype with version 3 has been a term that's been thrown around is business as usual, or BAU is how it's being shortened. The intent of the business as usual clause, or the mantra, is that it's really to try to get merchants to take a long view as it relates to PCI compliance. Instead of a once-a-year exercise to review their business practices, network diagrams, payment card data flows once a year, the effort is to make sure or to get organizations to review this on an ongoing basis, achieve compliance within those requirements. And it really, again, it's to alter the approach. It's not a one-time-a-year type of thing. You're supposed to be nurturing this along on an ongoing basis. Business as usual is really not new. The Council's been endorsing this as really an optimal approach. It's not considered a specific requirement, but really an optimal approach, and just really a mantra for guidance to how compliance with version 3.0 should be achieved. So these are just a few of what I would call considerations for compliance. Assessment is really a snapshot in time, and as we talked about with in Section 5, vulnerabilities, malware comes out almost on a daily basis, and sometimes several times a day. If you keep up, obviously, with which most everybody does, with Patch Tuesday, with the Microsoft environment, vulnerabilities emerge all the time. And compliance is not, as we talked about with business as usual, with that mantra, it's not really, it shouldn't be a one-time event that you do a few days prior to your assessors coming on site. So it should be something you are nurturing ongoing. Then finally, a question I get all the time is, if we store data, are we in compliance? Well, if you don't store data, then you reduce your PCI scope, and it really takes it down to a very small data set. And so that would be the number one suggestion I would say is, don't store any type of card data if you don't have to. Okay, so key takeaways. Again, going back to a business as usual process, there's an increase in by the Council in terms of making sure that employees in an organization are continuing to be made aware of PCI and security standards, and so making sure that entities and organizations continue the process of making employees aware. We had already talked about that, making sure that you keep an inventory of your system components in your PCI environment. We also talked about one of the major requirements or insertions into PCI version 3 is making sure that the POS machines are looked at on an ongoing basis. This kind of walks back to making sure that employees receive some type of training so that they're able to identify if there's tampering done with the card swipe, and making sure that they know how to report that such that if they do notice something, that's also a documented process. Vendor management. The emphasis is on security as a shared responsibility between vendors and merchants, and more merchants are moving towards IT operations as an outsourced model. So in an infographic which was accompanied with the release of PCI version 3, which was posted on the PCI Security Standards website, there was a statistic posted that I thought was interesting. It said that 63% of investigations identified a security deficiency which was easily exploited by hackers, revealed that a third party was responsible for system support and software development. So in 63% of the cases, a third party was responsible for some type of data compromise. So again, merchants are realizing it's more cost-effective and more secure for reducing your PCI scope if you outsource that. But again, you also have to make sure that that vendor or that service provider you use is holding dear and making sure that the cardholder data environment is secure. Pen testing. Pen testing is an important practice for organizations to understand the weaknesses in their infrastructure. Under version 3, pen testing becomes more formal and a structured process for both the merchant or service provider being assessed, as well as the pen testing firm. So with that said, we'll be closing out the presentation. It appears that with the changes in version 3, the Council is stressing more of a proactive approach in protecting cardholder data that focuses on security and less on compliance with the data security standard. It's really moving towards a security and risk management approach as opposed to, again, compliance. So with that said, it's wise to start planning now to make sure that your organization is ready for the changes articulated in version 3 of the DSS. Otherwise, your first assessment in 2014 or 2015 really may not go that well.
All right. Thank you very much, Nick, for taking the time to delve into the changes and additions and the new sections of the PCI 3.0. If anybody in our audience happens to have any questions, please click on the chat bubble on the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to type those in, and we will get to them as we can. Nick, it really seems like the PCI 3.0 and PCI in general, when the Council comes out with their requirements, they're very fluid. They seem to be amendable because at times they are changing. A lot of the people that we work with here at Secure State, many of the folks on the line might not know this, but we actually work with professional hackers. Part of our attack and defense team are the types of guys I'm really glad are on our side. They're always discovering new ways that some of the more malicious people out there are using to break in and compromise data, and so that's why it's necessary to make up to get together and review these standards and update them and clarify and so forth. So we appreciate you doing that, and it's very interesting hearing what's been added and your interpretation of those. We have a question from Gary about the pen testing, just like what I was talking about. He says, with pen testing being so critical, do you ever see the SSC approving pen testers as they do ASVs and QSAs? It seems like a big hole that needs to be addressed. It's an interesting question.
It is a good question.
Yeah.
And
approach.
I think that would be, they're taking a step in that direction with trying to put some rigor around and making sure in version 3 that there is a bit more formalization. They're endorsing the NIST framework as one option, and also there's mention of OWASP as a framework. But it'll be interesting to see how they move forward with that. I would think that a PCI certification for pen testing is not far off, and I would expect that we may see that probably by the next iteration of version 4.
When you were talking about the pen testers and them coming up with standards or frameworks for requirements of what pen testers look at, from your experience, were you seeing some people were going to DIY, doing the pen tests themselves, or what's about the worst that you were seeing? Some kind of going on the cheap and trying to really getting what they paid for?
Yes, absolutely. There are folks that obviously, Mike, as you said, they're trying to be more cost conscious, so they're just utilizing firms that may just utilize freeware and scanners. And, the old cliche that says you get what you pay for definitely holds true in those sorts of instances. So, in this business and with the volume of assessments that we've done with a variety of lines of business from retail to healthcare, manufacturing, and everything in between, you get to do some interaction with clients and what they're looking for, and you try to respect they're trying to go after low cost, but also try to advise them that sometimes low cost doesn't necessarily mean best quality.
Another question regarding pen tests. Like you said, it's a controversial yet highly, there's a lot of questions around it. People are trying to get a handle on these new additions. The audience member here says that we have 2 SAQDs. Do we need only one pen test or 2 separate pen tests?
Wow. Well, that sounds like a question that I would prefer to take offline, just because I'd prefer to kind of get a better understanding of the environment. It sounds like you've got 2 separate cardholder data environments, or PCI zones, and for that, I would say it really depends. So let's, if you don't mind, my email will be on the next slide that Michael will roll through. So if you wouldn't mind reaching out to me, and I'd prefer to kind of walk you through that and get a better understanding. But I'm happy to follow up with you and offer any insight that I'm able to.
Here's a good question from one of our audience members. She says, I'm in the middle of a PCI DSS version 2 assessment. Should I start over using version 3?
No, definitely not. PCI version 3 is effective, as we said, January 1st, 2014. And as organizations should begin incorporating the new standard into their payment security program as soon as they're able. But entities really have until December 31st, 2014 to fully adopt version 3. So after that date, all ROCs, or report on compliance, and SAQs are expected to follow version 3. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. Here's an interesting question regarding the method of some of the QSA work that you do on a daily basis. He says that some QSA firms are moving towards doing a large portion of the assessments remotely. Does Secure State still embrace this model, or do you still do on-site work?
At this time, we definitely do the on-site. I think it's I actually like the on-site just because we're able to talk to clients. We're able to get a better flow for their business environment, and a lot of times we're able to have that one-on-one with them, which sometimes in a remote setting we're not able to have, and so it's you're able to get more information, and it's just a more intimate, more I think productive environment to kind of have that on-site interaction with the client. And that's not to say that eventually we may not move to some type of hybrid model where on-site and off-site, but right now I think what we're doing kind of is really the best.
Yeah. So really we're still very much believers in the face-to-face model. We feel it's more thorough, and it just gets a lot of the questions answered. More timely too. There's a lot of things that we feel aren't necessarily covered when you're doing things remotely. So we're very hands-on business, as is yours. Question here, it says, is it true that there will be a new SAQ level for processing using HTML redirects? Have you heard that rumor?
I have not heard that rumor, and I have been monitoring the Council's website pretty actively since DSS version 3 was released, but I will follow up on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. If people are hearing that, that's worth looking back into. We've got a question here that takes us all the way back to requirement 1. Here's I put your slide up here. so you can see it. Where did my cursor go? And the question was specifically had to do with, with requirement 1.1.2. First one right there at the top of your screen. He says, does this refer to Category 2 devices?
So Category 2 devices are devices that are connected. And yes, I would say those would include Category 2 devices, or pardon me, Category 2 devices should be included on your network diagram.
Easy answer there to a good question. Do you have any recommendations for good sources of security awareness training, security checklists for retail employees? Because a lot of these recommendations require retailers to go back to their employees and train them, particularly about the point-of-sale devices. So any resources come to mind that people can check out online?
I don't have anything off the top of my head right now, but I know that you can get creative as it relates to doing retail training. I know that sometimes since retailers have stores all over the place, sometimes making sure that the store employees are trained and have an equal share of awareness training can be challenging. So using PowerPoints, using paper, I think is all fair game. But unfortunately, I don't have a website that I can recommend off the top of my head, or any type of resources off the top of my head. But again, I would say getting creative. Paper is, while it's considered faux pas in an electronic age, I think it's low cost and it's easy, as well as you're able to maybe do some quizzes and be able to have at the end of the day some type of validation that the store employee understood, as well as maybe have a quiz that said that you'd be able to get some type of quantitative result of their level of understanding.
All right, and again, thank you to everybody that's submitting questions. This is a very important topic to us here at Secure State, and we appreciate everybody that's chiming in here. This next question has language in it that I only feel that a QSA would understand, which I'm admittedly not a QSA. So this is an auditor language, and I'll do my best. He says, why are there so few P2PE-HW validated solutions available? Are these the easiest means to comply with PCI?
It's a really good question. I'll start with the second question first. As to my knowledge, there is only one company that has been validated as P2PE. I believe it's called European Payment Solutions. And at this time, I can't tell you why there's so few. I know the process is fairly rigorous to have that, to become P2PE certified. And I know we're looking into the prospect of possibly becoming a P2PE QSA company. But at this time, I know the council is evaluating a number of vendors for that, but I can't offer a hard and fast reason why why there's not more.
Very interesting. And again, I appreciate everybody's submitting questions. If we don't happen to get to yours, we do apologize, but we'll answer a few more here before we sign off and leave everybody to their get back to work. The question here was, do you need segmentation if your CDE is only composed of standalone pin pads?
Wow. This is another question that I think would merit a follow-up call or some type of follow-up communication, because I would imagine that if your data is the intake is by way of data intake, or the card swipe is by way of the pin pad, comes into the system, normally that's traversing through a network, unless it's going directly to the to your processor, and that would be a P2PE solution. At least that would have the earmarks of a P2PE solution. I would think that the PCI zone is probably a little bigger. So if you don't mind, feel free to contact me at my email address, and I'll hopefully be able to we'll be able to have a conversation and hopefully get you a bit more information on that.
Yeah, learn a little bit more about a specific environment. Every environment is different.
Exactly.
What you say when you have experience in your QSA work, you're probably seeing a little bit of everything.
Absolutely.
No two networks are the same. So we do appreciate you asking questions, and we do hope that you'll get in touch with Nick following this. So we'll go ahead and just field 2 more questions and let everybody get back to their day. This one, speaking of your QSA experience, this one touches a bit on something that, just some opinion maybe, or maybe some of your experience when you've been on site. This says, have you ever had multiple group member companies rolling up under one merchant ID and they fill out different SAQs? Do you submit one for the roll-up company or one for each GMC? Have you ever experienced that ever?
Yes, actually. I've seen it a number of different ways, and unfortunately, I would say it really goes back to making sure that you have a relationship with your acquirer or your merchant bank, because they'll ultimately be able to best provide you guidance in terms of how they would like to receive that information. Because I've seen it different ways, and different merchant banks require different ways. So unfortunately, there's not one good answer for you. So again, I would encourage you to have that conversation with your merchant bank.
Yeah, very, very specific questions, but all good ones, absolutely. So we're going to wrap it up with this last question. And as we mentioned when we gave that short poll at the beginning of the presentation, we were talking about some people have no experience. They're absolutely new to PCI, and then there's some old pros. This is a question, Nick, from a noob, from a rookie to PCI. She says, I'm starting at square one with PCI. I have no idea on how to achieve compliance. What would you suggest should be my first steps? Where should she start off?
Well, I would suggest bringing in a QSA, maybe 3 to 6 months or 6 to 9 months prior to your first PCI assessment, and whether that's under version 3 or 2, if there's more immediacy to that. But in order really to give yourself enough time to do what we call a gap assessment. So what we would do is we would come in, identify any gaps in your environment as it relates to the DSS, the Data Security Framework, and address and offer you some suggestions as it relates to shortcomings, and then obviously provide you with some type of suggestions or remediation plan to get you on the path to compliance.
All right, excellent. And thank you, everybody, again, for your questions. We wanted to thank everybody for participating with today's exclusive Secure State webinar, Dissecting PCI DSS 3.0. A reminder that today's webinar was recorded and will be made available shortly. So, on behalf of Nick Vaccarello, my name is Michael Wilt. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.